All right. Hello. Welcome to the third edition of Two Persians, One Rice Cooker. I'm Sina, and with me is once again my co-host Bayan Furitan.
Yo.
And yeah, uh, I know we're a bit late this time. The time in between each podcast is a little longer than we'd like it to be, but both on a positive and negative, it seems like every time there's a long transition between each podcast, there is an abundance of topics to talk about because so much happens in between these podcasts that it's kind of insane. Like in the second podcast, the corona epidemic just spiraled out of control, and now we have a race war that's spiraling out of control. So it's very interesting. Do you see a direct correlation between these world events and our podcast?
Yes, we're in a simulation that shapes itself around us.
Exactly. That's egocentrism at its finest right there.
Yes.
The world just completely revolves around us.
Yeah, it works for the sole purpose of creating content for our podcast.
And does it create content? Yeah. Oh boy. I mean, with the coronavirus epidemic, it's like I've talked to baby boomers who said that in their lifetime nothing like this has ever happened before, and I just say, thank Two Persians and One Rice Cooker for that. We bring you all the catastrophes in the world.
Yes.
But in this case, anyways, we wanted to focus on the events happening within the United States, particularly the protests surrounding the injustice and the injustice surrounding the killing of George Floyd. Now, for people who are not familiar with this incident, there was a man who was simply driving, and the cops pulled him over, and were essentially very harshly. What's the term? I don't want to use manhandling here, but they were essentially pressing him down on the floor, and one of the police officers placed a knee over that man's neck, and shortly afterwards he died. Now, there's an autopsy report that suggests that, well, it doesn't suggest, it concludes that he didn't die from suffocation, but rather it was a heart condition that caused his death. But nonetheless, it goes without saying that this is far and away an injustice that does need to be rectified in some way or another. And we're going to be discussing the aftermath of this incident and how the world's reacted and what are the tactics that we agree with and what are some of the elements of these protests that are questionable. With that out of the way, Bayan, how would you, given what's been happening over the course of these past few days, how do you interpret the fallout of this incident?
Well, how I interpret the fallout is that several things are kind of happening at the same time. What I mean by that is that people were already on edge from everything going on with COVID, staying at home, not being able to work or at all or to the capacity that they would like or need to, that there were already, so to speak, pre-existing conditions within the US of certain things being the case that make life more difficult than it needs to be. And amongst those, we could enumerate general police incompetence and police brutality. We can enumerate a degree of poverty that is unnecessary and unjust. We can enumerate certain laws that are in place, maybe not necessarily in California at the time being, but in the whole, or not to the same degree in California, but all over the country, relating to, for example, a lot of people being prisoned due to non-violent drug offenses, those people then not being able to work because there's a criminal background check done on them, all kinds of stuff going on at the same time that makes life more pathological than it needs to be, as Jordan Peterson would have liked to say, probably. And those things then it creates like this pressure cooker environment, in my opinion, where tensions and displeasure and pain and suffering build up further and further until there's going to be one final straw that breaks the camel's back. And in my opinion, this is what happened here. This would be like the short form of what I think happened.
So, follow-up question in relation to this: what do you think is going to change when it comes to, like, what makes this particular what makes this particular set of events different from, let's say, Ferguson or Baltimore, where there were a series of riots that ensued, but then when you think of the aftermath, there wasn't this radical shift in policy where, let's say, police departments were vetted, and they were vetting their officers to make sure that there weren't any racial elements. Like, let's say that there was a cop with a swastika, or that had ties with a organization that was listed as listed as radical by the Poverty Law Center, for example. So do you think this is going to fall in line with Ferguson and Baltimore, where there was a series of protests, but the end result was middling at best? Or do you think there might actually be a good policy prescription that gets established this time around?
Yeah. So my first answer would be a more superfluous one, which is that I would take everything that the Southern Poverty Law Center says with an extremely large grain of salt. So, I mean, just because they say that someone or a group is a hate group or a person who is hateful or racist or whatever, I have seen too many instances. I couldn't enumerate them exactly right now, but I remember when I was reading through it, there were quite a few people on there who were definitely not supposed to be on that list. That aside, the thing is this. I mean, this is my opinion about all of this, and this might be considered or perceived as a radical opinion, but I think it is rather not, which is that I don't think that racism in and of itself is the problem. And the reason why I think that is this. When we think about a police officer, what is important about that police officer? What is important is that the police officer performs his or her duty despite their personal beliefs equally and fairly amongst the citizens. And what I mean is this. Let's say you have an extreme Democrat who is extreme left liberal, Antifa type person who happens to be a cop, however unlikely that is.
Cory Booker.
Sure. And now that person is a cop and goes out. Essentially, my point would be, as long as this person administers the policing fairly to an old white rich Republican, the same as a poor Latino person, it is irrelevant to me that they identify as being on the far left, because the duty of a police officer is not to believe in a certain ideology or not believe in a certain fallacy, such as racism, but it is to administer the law and to police fairly. Now, some people might say, well, their personal beliefs might interfere with that, and they might. But as long as they don't, it is irrelevant. For example, I work as an auditor. And let's say if my personal belief was that, I want to use a fictitious example in order not to really get in trouble here. Let's say for some reason I don't like that certain products are manufactured in China under conditions that I find inhumane. But then I get put on a job where I'm supposed to audit a company that works under conditions like that. They have a factory in China, and the conditions there are what I would consider to be inhumane. If I perform my audit properly, then there's no problem with me holding that belief. But if I try to sabotage the audit because of my belief, then there is a problem. Do you see what I'm saying? I see. Go ahead. No, I just wanted to see whether you would follow along with what I'm trying to say here.
No, I'm following along.
Okay. And so whenever I hear, for example, that the problem is racist cops, my gut reaction would be no. It is not the fact that they are racist that is a problem. The underlying problem to me is that they are incapable, if they are racist, right? It is not evident that they are racist. They might simply be completely incapable and completely under, doing things wrong. They're just not capable of properly performing their duties as a police officer, and they are trained badly, and they are hostile, but they might not even be racist. But regardless of that, let's say they are racist and they do what they did, then my retort would be they're incapable of differentiating between their personal and professional life, and then act in a way that is completely inappropriate for the position that they are in, and that needs to have repercussions or punishment or retributions to the victim or the victim's family, whatever the case may be. Then justice needs to be served based on that person's actions. I don't want to take away from that person's actions. But that's kind of my first answer to that. And the reason why is because we cannot sift out what is a particular police officer's belief. Now, obviously, if it is something radical, like you were saying, like let's say the person is a self-proclaimed Nazi or the person is a self-proclaimed terrorist, once that person starts to express such extreme opinions, the extremity of it is troubling, and that would then become problematic, and a person like that might not be able to be accepted as a police officer, the same way that maybe my example earlier was not that good. If a person is a self-proclaimed Antifa member who has participated in violent protests, maybe that's not necessarily the best example. But I was just trying to say that not only the secondary thing of it is that racism, the definition of racism has changed. And that is also why I'm hesitant to use that as a preclusion of if a person is racist, they shouldn't be a police officer, because according to some people, racism can only exist if you're in a position of power, and that can only exist if you're white versus black in this country. And so therefore, then all of a sudden, if there was a Latino person who hates Asians, then that all of a sudden can't be racist, because Latinos are, based on that person's opinion, not on mine, not in a position of power, and therefore they're incapable by definition of being racist. So see, when there's words thrown around like that, it makes me hesitant to use that as a definition on who should and should not be a police officer. And that's why I would rather look at, first of all, the extremity of that person's opinion, if there is one, and then does that show or reflect in their behavior as an officer, and then go from there.
Right. Yeah. On that, I mean, there are several points to which I want to extrapolate upon. One is that I think you're right that the term racist is so loaded. It's such a loaded term. I remember watching a podcast with Orson Scott Card, who is the author of Ender's Game. And he basically talks about the power of words at one point and how racist has essentially now become the most powerful word in the English language, because the instant someone is denoted as a racist, their entire lives are ruined from that point onwards. And no other word holds that sort of power. And I just thought it was a very fascinating read. Because, I mean, there is truth to that statement. If somebody is denoted as a racist, then particularly, let's say, in a college campus, then he's basically going to be ostracized from the community for his entire span as an undergrad or graduate or wherever that student is at that point at that school. But another point that I want to make is with relation to what you said about cops and the fact that it may very well be incompetency as opposed to just blanket racism. One interesting motif about this era is that, like you said, the definition of racism has changed over time, and what at one point was explicit has now essentially become more implicit, in that people don't judge racist actions on the level of, like the racist caricature, someone going out in the streets and saying and yelling profanities at a person of color. But rather, there are these theses that are being drawn out that, well, what about implicit bias? What about people's perception of a different race, and how does that factor in shaping their behavior? And how essential is that when dictating who should be in law enforcement, for example? Mm-hmm. So what do you say to the idea that that sort of implicit bias actually plays a very active role in terms of how African Americans are treated in this country, with relation to vetting, with relation to profiling, with relation to just maybe harsher action taken by cops to that particular minority as opposed to white people?
My first question would be, how is something like that measured?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, because when I look at certain data points, I have not come across numbers that would show, there are some things that, well, let me, I guess, get a little bit more to the point. Like, for example, I was looking at the police shootings that related, fatal police shootings in 2019. So the Washington Post actually does a pretty decent job tracking all kinds of related fatal police shootings within the country, and they then document all of the information that they have about it: the person's gender, the person's race, the person's, whether they were fleeing or not fleeing, whether they were armed or unarmed, different things like that. Like you have this whole matrix. And for example, before I even tell you the results, what would be your instinct in, like, what do you think those numbers reflect?
Well, I mean, if my perception was reflective of, let's say, like the mainstream media narrative, then I would say that African Americans would be disproportionately affected by fatal police shootings. but my assumption would be that it is far below that projected estimate. Where it compares to, let's say, white people, I'm not sure. Considering that they're a majority of the population, I would say that the amounts of white people who are shot on a yearly basis is double that of African Americans.
Not quite, but it is higher. So I'm looking at it right now in 2019, according to this post, there were 370 white people that were shot and killed and 235 black people that were shot and killed, and that's out of a total of 1,004 that at least the Washington Post has been keeping track of. And, I was thinking, okay, maybe the problem is that unarmed people are, is where the problem is, right? So within the 1,004 people, there were 41 people within the country that were shot and killed and were unarmed. And out of those 41, 19 are white and 9 are black. Then I thought, okay, maybe it is people who are unarmed and actually fleeing the scene, let's say by foot, and that brings the results down to 9 people, and out of those 9 people, it's split between 4 whites and 4 blacks. But when I looked through the 4 blacks, actually 1 repeated. So it was 4, unless there's a person with the same name twice, but I think that's unlikely. But it seems like there might actually be 4 white people and 3 black people. Now, the only reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is a question that I have for you. Because, okay, let's say implicit bias plays a role and blah, blah, blah. Is that indicative from your perspective? Now, I don't want to evade your question, but before I get to the heart of the question, I'm curious as to how you define the problem. Do you define that problem as a localized problem or as a systemic problem?
That's a good question.
Because that would change my response.
Frankly, I'm going to say it's a systemic problem. Do you want me to elaborate, or do you want to go on?
Yeah, elaborate. And when you elaborate, specifically help me understand how do you define the difference? Like what is the differentiating factor between localized and systemic?
Mm-hmm. Well, how I would define localized would be that there are these isolated incidents that occur across the country where individuals act on impulses that are not reflective of the institution. Mm-hmm. So if there are isolated incidents of police officers that are shooting African Americans, but it's not necessarily tied back to like the head of the department, then I would say that's localized. When I say it's systemic, I mean I think on the level of, let's say, sentencing, and the fact that it's not just that the incarceration rate for African Americans is disproportionately high compared to the rest of the population. It's also the fact that they have longer prison sentences for essentially acting on the same crimes as their white counterparts. If it's low offense drug usage, a black person might have a prison sentence that is 2 years longer than, let's say, their white counterpart. I would say that is endemic of a systemic problem.
Why? It's because, and the reason I say why is this, because when we talk about some other claims that are made, such as the wage gap between men and women, and the fact that depending on how you slice the numbers, if you just take a big total, that essentially doesn't mean anything, right? You just take a big total of all the men and all the women in this country, and you look at and you compare their income, that there is a difference of men's income being higher than women's income. And for example, past conversations that you and I have had, we would say, well, the mere fact that there is a difference is not indicative of a problem. The mere fact that there is a difference is only indicative that we need to do further investigation. So my question to you would be, why does the mere fact that there is a difference show a problem? And I want to elaborate just a tiny little bit on that question, because let's say, for example, two crimes are committed that have the same label, armed robbery, right? But one person happens to do an armed robbery with a pocket knife, and the other person happens to do an armed robbery with a grenade and shotgun. Now, those two might have the same crime, armed robbery, but one appropriately has a higher sentence than the other because one was committed with a shotgun and grenade and the other one with a pocket knife. So the degree of the crime is different, which if we look at a justice system, it is fair that one is longer than the other. An armed robbery with a pocket knife is not as dangerous to society as someone walking around with a shotgun and grenade. So that is just an example I'm coming up with. Now, there's no way for me to look at every sentencing and the conditions of every sentencing. So I'm not trying to ask you, like, give me the particulars of every single case. But my question to you is, are you saying to me that the mere difference in and of itself is the evidence of systemic racism, or is there more to it?
Well, I mean, like every case, there is more to it, in that you would have to, honestly, to really diagnose this issue, you would have to look through every individual case and then basically make a judgment call from there in relation to, are these crimes exactly the same, and was there different treatment on the basis of race, or were there different offshoots? Like, but my one caveat to your point would be the difference. I mean, there are varying degrees of criminality with relation to, let's say, armed robbery, but when it comes to low offense drug use, I mean, what, one person is smoking one more joint than the other individual? I mean, the variant degrees of criminality don't, when it comes to low offense drug use, unless you're a drug dealer yourself, they're not very varied. And I think I can make a judgment call when saying that, with relation to prosecutions, it just doesn't make sense to me still. Maybe you could clarify this point and provide certain examples as to why certain low offense drug users, why certain low offense drug usages require a greater sentencing, requires a longer sentence than, let's say, another example of that.
Well, my first point about analyzing information would be this, that the further out you go, the less useful the information becomes. Meaning that if we were to just take, for example, the whole world and look at which races were incarcerated at which rate, that would not really tell us anything, because there's huge differences between what's happening in Philadelphia versus what's happening in Tehran. Like, you can't just take those two and treat them as if they're the same thing. But so my first thing would be, how detailed is this data? Obviously, at some point it needs to be summarized, because otherwise you would need to look at every individual instance. But I'm saying, is it summarized by the country? Is it summarized by state, by city, by county? Because all those things make a difference, because the way that our country is structured, laws to a degree can be more strict depending on where you're at. So, for example, state laws have now decided to make certain drugs recreationally available and not a criminal offense. such as California, such as Colorado. So they have said, well, we make it more lenient, for example, but states can also make it stricter by saying, no, if you're caught with drugs, we're going to give you this minimum sentence. And another state says, no, if you're caught with drugs, we're going to give you another minimum sentence. And so my first question is this, for example, segregated by states? Because if one state has, let's say a higher concentrated population of Black people who happen to use certain substances that they consider to be illegal than another state where there happens to be more white people that also happen to use less of those substances for whatever reason, and one state has more lenient laws and the other one less lenient laws. Like, there's so many things that could go into it. It could be racism. I'm not trying to eliminate that, but I'm trying to say, how is the data presented? Because if it's just a whole by the country, then I don't see how we can use that information to make a useful assessment.
Yeah, no, you definitely got me there. I'm just trying to jog my thoughts right now. It's a very, very astute assessment in relation to that. Well, I mean, ultimately, neither of us could deduce whether it's racism or not, because to do so would require, and it would require a scrupulous amount of research on both our parts to really. I mean, we would basically have to look at every single individual criminal justice case and then make an Excel sheet or some sort and estimate the data from there. But it's very hard to deduce these sort of outcomes. So you're right. Maybe I made a too quick of a judgment call with relation to labeling something systemic without properly analyzing the data.
No, I don't think you did. I think it's that the definition of systemic racism has changed to something that doesn't mean systemic racism. Because, for example, I think that there's a much, much stronger case to be made that there's systemic sexism against men, for example. Because if we use the standard of numbers are what determine, total overarching numbers are what determine whether something is systemic or not, then I would say, well, it must be. If that is the standard we use, then we have to agree that the system is systemically sexist against men. Because, for example, out of all the police shootings that occurred in 2019, as tracked by the Washington Post, out of the 1,004, 961 were men. 961 out of 1,004. So, if we are saying that the fact that the number of years or the number of the sentence of Black people versus white people is longer for the same crimes, and that is the evidence of systemic racism, not even indicative, but the evidence thereof, then we must agree that there is systemic sexism against men as well. We must agree on that, because the premise is that as long as there are differences, that those differences are the evidence of a systemic fallacy, systemic racism, systemic sexism, whatever you want to label you want to put on it. And if we use that for one case, we have to use that for another case too. We can't be inconsistent and hypocritical and cherry pick what we want and not want to consider. Now, I don't agree with that, but I'm saying if we make that claim, we must make that across the board.
Yeah, no, it's funny because with relation to all the ongoing events right now, my first instinct was to basically prop up all these narratives or presuppositions that people have made about systemic racism. And my first instinct was actually to look through the data. So, for example, one thing that I was actually interested in was how there's such a massive income gap on the basis of race. Mm-hmm. Because in my mind, the Equal Pay Act was set up in 1963. And in the Civil Rights Bill, Title VII was enacted. So it's like when you could file a complaint to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on whether or not there is discrimination by wage or employment-based discrimination, how is it that the median income of black house owners in comparison to white house owners is 64%? Like black people make 64% of what white people make on the basis of household income. And the more that I looked into it, because I mean the immediate assumption or the immediate narrative assumption was that it's racial labor income is the racial labor income gap. Mm-hmm. That there is an inherent wage discrepancy. There's an inherent wage discrepancy with relation to work. For like white people get paid the same amount, they get paid more for the same labor. The more that I looked into it, it seems like that was less and less the case. And in fact, the barriers to wealth accumulation were things like saving rates or inheritance or the rate of return on investment or the fact that a ton of black investors haven't invested in the stock market. Or, I mean, there are also certain historic injustices like redlining. So like, black house owners don't have that. For example, black house owners don't hold the same level of equity as, let's say, white house owners, according to a ton of Pew Research polls. I think it was around 64% of all white house owners had house equity, and then black house owners had 34%. So there are some discrepancies on the basis of past discrimination. So it's redlining, it's insurers prioritizing white house owners over black house owners at some point, although those barriers over time receded, the leftovers were still there. But the point that I'm trying to make is that while that's one component of it, another component of it is just simply on the basis that a lot of white family house owners simply take riskier business ventures than, let's say, black house owners, which I thought was interesting. Like, for example, in terms of business asset accumulation or stock market investments, white house owners basically quadruple in terms of asset management. And the only with relation to this, the only form of what's the word? The only place where black family house owners overtake white family house owners with relation to this is debt collection.
Yeah.
So I hate saying this, but while some of it is in fact historic injustices, as I was researching it, some of it is also personal responsibility as well, and how you handle your income and what sort of assets you invest in. Like, that actually contributed greatly to that wage discrepancy. And it seems like wherever I go, it's funny. Anytime there's some sort of narrative that I want to support, like a single narrative, like, let's say, reparations or sexism in the workplace, there's always a myriad of other circumstances that sort of, on the one hand, slightly elevate that narrative, but there are also like 20 other variable factors that basically put what's the word? They basically I don't want to say it. Man, I'm struggling for words today, but there's a myriad of factors that actually, what's the term, man? I don't want to say it topples that narrative, but it basically delegitimizes that narrative in some capacity.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, my first question would be that wage gap in between blacks and whites that you mentioned. Is that total by country? Is that by state? Is that by city? Because different states have different minimum wages and different cost of living, which has different wages in general. Different cities have different wages. In Southern California, you most likely would get paid more for the same job in downtown LA than you would in Bakersfield. So, how was that data disaggregated? Was it again just a huge total, or was it more disaggregated than that?
Oh, is that a question directed at me?
Yeah, like when you were doing your research, how is the information presented when someone makes the case of, when you go online and you want to read about it and you say, oh, I want to see whether there's systemic racism for the wage gap, and you go online and people make that case, or institutions make that case. Do they make that case based on not disaggregated information at all, like just one total of the country, and they say that is indicative of that, or that is the evidence of that? Or do they drill down further and say, look, even if we look by state, even if we look by city, we keep on seeing that same difference? Or even if we look by profession, it's like with the same amount of experience and this and that, and it's like the further you disaggregate, it shows the same thing over and over.
Right. No. These are aggregated accounts. They're random population samples.
Okay.
Yeah. But to your point. Oh God, I actually forgot my headspace. Quickly, talk and save me while I get my head together.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing that kind of, this is always what it brings it down to me, which is that when there's something that is considered a potential problem, right? I don't disagree, for example, with the fact that if there is a stark difference in between wages of whites versus blacks, now that is possibly problematic. And the reason why I say possibly is because, again, it wouldn't really matter if there's enough for everyone. So, for example, if it just so happens that for some reason there's a concentrated, amount of white people who happen to be CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, but the median or average income of blacks is $80,000 a year, maybe that would not necessarily be a problem, but that just somehow happens to skew the population in one way or the other. But it could also be the evidence of racism in one way or another. And so the question then becomes, what does this information represent? And that is always the problematic part. And whenever anyone tries to reduce it to one answer, such as the reason why the wage gap between two skin colors or ethnicities is different within the country of hundreds of millions of people is only because of one thing and one thing only, which is racism, that is already something I could not accept as a premise, because that it cannot be one simple thing. We cannot reduce the population of hundreds of millions of people with, all these people working and employing and doing this and that every single thing going on within this whole big country is that it all gets reduced to one thing of racism is such a gross oversimplification that it could simply not be that. And I think that is why there is so little change within this country as it comes to these kinds of things, because if we for example, you know, I'm living my life a certain way and I work at a company, and I happen to know as a fact that, for example, when you start off working there, everyone that graduates from college starts at the same wage. It doesn't matter what college you went to. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter what skin color you are. Nothing matters. You simply, when you graduate and apply for a job there out of graduation without really any, if you're a college hire, let's call it that, right? Not an experienced hire, not someone who worked and then wants to work at my company. If you're a college recruited hire, everyone starts the same. So, for example, I would say, well, I work at a pretty big company that is in a more quote-unquote conservative field of accounting and auditing, and I see the evidence of the opposite. I see the evidence of actually equity to the degree that I almost disagree with, which is that your experience and your skills and your capacity don't matter. We're just going to give the same to everyone. That's okay, you know, okay, if you want to do it that way, as a starting point at least, that's fine with me, but that to me is actually the evidence of the exact opposite happening. So does that mean that my company is not part of the system? Like, are we outside of this system? Because if it's systemic, it by definition means that it is inherently part of the system, meaning that if we say systemic racism, it means that the system in and of itself is inherently racist.
Right, and then I mean, if you break down our code of laws, there is not a single law that has pro-discriminatory measures at this point in time. So
exactly
the idea. So I mean, if it was systemic, then there'd be active clauses that separate families or separate neighborhoods on the basis of race, but that no longer exists. So how could something be labeled as systemic if it's prying underneath the surface and all we have is suppositions to back up our assumptions as opposed to actual data? It's interesting. You know, the more I think about it, particularly when it comes to this generation, and I'm not just talking about millennials or Generation Z, I'm just talking about this particular period in time, more and more people and institutions seem to be using availability heuristics as a measurement for policy making or change that needs to be enacted. And what I mean by availability heuristics is they're basically like mental shortcuts where people rely on immediate examples that come to a given person's mind when evaluating any sort of topic. So it's kind of like what we just discussed. The instance somebody thinks of a cop shooting a black person, their first instinct is racism, right? And it's not backed up by evidence, but it's just the first thing that comes to mind. And as a result, people just keep going off of that route. And just to further back up what you're saying, I mean, even with a relation to the Equal Pays Act, which, I mean, was enacted on a federal level, but had to be approved by states. And as far as I know, 42 states out of 50 passed it. And that skews the data quite a bit. I mean, if there are 8 states that haven't ratified it.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much we could discuss on this. How much more we have? How much more I have to say? Do you have anything more to add?
Yes, which is that, see, when you reduce the narrative to one single problem, that I think is part of it, right? I mean, in the sense that, for example, I am not trying to say that there is no evidence of racism anywhere under any circumstances. That would be a completely, falsehood. I do see racism. I do agree there's racism. There are people that act on their racist beliefs and do horrible things. Of course that exists, and of course that's real. So I hope I'm not coming across as I'm denying, like a Holocaust denier of, oh, it never happened, or this is not happening at all, everyone's making it up. No, of course this is happening. But the problem is that if we want to stop that from happening, the first thing that we need to do is to properly identify the problem. If we do not properly identify the problem, then we're fighting the wrong thing. So if we're saying the system is in and of itself racist, we need to overhaul it and just start, just throw the whole thing over and just do something completely new and different, I would caution against that if we're doing it with the assumption that the system is in and of itself racist, because then we are serving an injustice to the individuals who are not. Because we must also be able to admit and acknowledge that there are individuals part of this so-called system that are not racist. And if we overthrow the system, then we will overthrow them as well. And for example, it's like that's one aspect of it. The one aspect of it is that that is a consequentialist way of looking at it, and I don't like that, which is that as long as the ends are what we want, which is a system free of racism, the means don't matter. Even if we have to have collateral damage, it doesn't matter as long as we get the end result, and I don't agree with that line of thinking to begin with. So that's my first point. My second point is that when we make this narrative of there is systemic racism specifically against Black people, then there's automatically already cognitive dissonance. That whenever there is anything that is an evidence against that narrative but is still a problem, then it gets dismissed. So, for example, whenever I really almost want to say without exception, I still have not heard an exception of that happening. When, especially in the recent days, anyone so far that I have heard talks about police brutality, and when they use examples specifically, they only use examples of Black people dying, right, by the hands of police. So my first thing would be to say that regardless of the victim's race, the fact that a police officer murdered, not justifiably killed, so not there was a shootout, the civilian was shooting at the police officers and the police officers were shooting back, and within that shootout, the civilian happened to die. Obviously, that is a very different circumstance, right? We're talking about an unjustified killing, which I would define as a murder in this case, right? So would you agree with that? That that's a problem, not if there's a shootout and the civilian happens to die?
Yes.
Okay. So when there's a murder, right? Every single murder that occurs, regardless of the victim's race or gender or any characteristic of that victim, it is a problem and justice needs to be served, regardless. Whether the victim is white or Black, it doesn't matter. Justice needs to be served and the police officer needs to be punished. If murder happens within civilian territory, like let's say I, Neil, on your neck until you die, that's at a minimum manslaughter. At a minimum. So that needs to be the case for everyone across the boards. Police officers are not above the law. Now, what happens though is because of that cognitive dissonance, cases where white people get killed by police officers, sometimes police officers that are actually part of a minority group, that all of a sudden doesn't fit the narrative anymore, and it gets completely dismissed and disregarded. And in my opinion, that is an injustice served to the victims who suffered and died as well, because now it's completely dismissed because it does not fit the narrative. For example, you have the two primary examples, in my opinion, that are really, really bad are you have one case of Robert Sycon in Missouri, right? This guy, okay, here's the conditions of what happened. And I have never heard of this guy before I started to do my own research, and there's barely like coverage or information about him from any kind of mainstream news sources. The most mainstream news source I saw was Fox 8. This guy was driving in the car with, I think it was his girlfriend, and they're just driving down the street. All of a sudden, a police car pulls them over, and this is the story told by the lady in the car who was the driver, right? And then the man in the car who happened to get shot and killed was the passenger. Apparently, the police officer already comes out of the car with the gun out and says, passenger, put your hands out the window. The passenger, he puts his hands out the window. Apparently, he had a lighter in his hand. He tosses it in the car and he puts his hands out. The police officer comes, roughly grabs him out of the car, pats him down very roughly and aggressively, throws him against like the side of the truck and like is, you know, like manhandling him essentially. Even for all you, I'm not saying women couldn't do that. That's simply the term that is used. So he's quote unquote manhandling him, right? And even the guy, he's asking, why are you being so aggressive towards me? Like, I'm unarmed, I'm complying, you know? Anyway, so that happens. Then something happens. There's a little, let's call it an encounter, right? But no one's life is in danger. Just a quick encounter, and the guy starts running away. He's running away by foot, unarmed. The police officer calls after him and says, if you don't stop, I'm going to kill you. The guy keeps on running. The cop repeats himself, if you don't stop, I am going to kill you, right? Then shoots and kills him. And you know that what the warrant was for that guy on why the cops were trying to look for him? It was because he was out on a child support warrant. So now apparently he has been in some robberies in the past or stuff like that, but he was never in a violent crime, and he was never involved in a violent crime. Like, he had some theft and stuff like that, and apparently there was this child support warrant out on him, and he shot and killed him as he's fleeing the scene by foot without unarmed. So my question becomes, why is this not blown up? And the reason, my suspicion, is because it does not fit that narrative. And now an injustice, let's call it an injustice by lack of acknowledgement, is served to this man who died and his family because people don't really care, because it's not part of the narrative. It goes against the narrative. And that, to me, is problematic, because when we are willing as a society to overlook and dismiss and disregard injustices that happen because they do not fit a certain narrative, that to me is a huge problem. So I would say that the problem with the narrative of systemic racism also is that we do not take an injustice at face value, such as a person who, let's say, maybe not innocent in the court of law of, okay, he didn't pay his child support, that's not good, and he broke the law, fair enough, but that's not something worth killing him over as he's fleeing the scene. So now that is a gross injustice, and it is completely dismissed and disregarded by the society in large because it does not fit the narrative. And to me, that is extremely problematic. There's another case, just really quickly, there's another case of, there's this guy in a hotel room with his girlfriend or wife, I don't remember, and apparently they were drunk and belligerent, and someone called the police, and the police came, and already, like, crazy, this guy is like, the police officers with this, like, rifle, pointing the rifle at this guy, and he's like completely complying with the police officer, but the police officer is giving him absurd instructions, right? The guy is on his knees with his hands up. Right then and there they could have gone and arrested him, but instead, gun pointing at him, rifle pointing at him, and I don't mean this as a joke, but it really looks like you're in some video game. Like, that rifle had the type of equipment on it as if I'm in, Call of Duty, modifying my gun and putting special things on it. Like, it was not a handgun. It was like some military type rifle. And he's like, put your hands down, put your hands down, put your hands up where I can see them. Put your hands behind your back. No, not behind your back. I need to see them. If you don't put them in front of you, I'm going to shoot you right now. Okay, now don't move. If you move, I'm going to shoot you. Put your hands up. Okay, now lay down with your face on the ground and put your hands behind your head. Now, stand back up again. If you move, I'm gonna shoot you. Crawl towards me very slowly with your hands up. And then the guy starts crawling. Like, there's all these instructions of like, hands up, hands down. I'm gonna shoot you. I'm gonna kill you if you don't do what I say. And the guy is like crying and saying, please don't shoot me. Please. I'm like crying, right? And eventually he starts crawling towards the police officer, and his shorts start falling down. And he reaches to his waist to pull up his shorts and gets shot immediately and dies. And if I remember correctly, the police officer, which is completely irrelevant, but just for making the case of that it does not necessarily have to be systemic racism, happened to be Latino, if I remember correctly. And if I also remember correctly, on his arm, it was edged, "You're fucked." Like, he edged on his own rifle, "You're fucked," apparently. And you know what else is interesting? That apparently that was not admitted as evidence in the courts. And so that to me is indicative of a really, really bad problem, that evidence like that is not admitted into the court, that he has weapons like that he shot this person who clearly was not a threat to him, clearly not a threat to him. I mean, if you watch the video, this guy is begging for his life. And yet, nothing really happened. There was not really any outcry. There was, yes, okay, like the Washington Post posted the video, it got millions of views, some people spoke out about it, this and that, but he, for example, let me look his name again, Daniel Shaver, right? He is not part of this narrative. He is not part of the police brutality narrative because he's white. And that, to me, is the problem, that we do not take an injustice for what it is and then say, this man has been murdered, justice needs to be served, but rather we first evaluate, does it fit within our meta-narrative? Yes? Okay, use that information. No? Okay, disregard that information. And I disagree with that line of thinking.
No, I mean, it's a good chain of thinking there. The idea, well, selective justice is not justice in any way, shape, or form. And this is another example of that, how if it doesn't fit, if it doesn't, if certain events don't matriculate into, let's say, the democratic narrative in this case, then they're just simply not covered. But the thing is, I would actually take it both directions, because on the one hand, we have incidents like this where it's like only Fox 16 covered this story of insane police ineptitude. But then, I mean, on the other hand, for example, I look at the George Zimmerman case in which Trayvon Martin was shot, and I think back to the fact that he basically claimed self-defense when Trayvon Martin was running, and he was basically acquitted by the courts.
Yeah.
And I mean, based off all the available evidence that I've seen, that in itself was an injustice, because at the very least he should have been hit with a manslaughter charge, but no, he was just acquitted.
Absolutely.
So I just think it goes both ways in that respect, that it seems that narratives are driving everything as opposed to just simple justice and due process.
Yes. Yes. I mean, the thing is that this, to me, is again the larger problem of identity politics. Because, for example, when I'm listening to, again, different things going on right now, what is the general narrative? For example, when I hear certain Black people speak on this issue, actually, there were some that they were very insightful. There was this one guy, I forgot his name. I think his name was Dr. Sean McMillan or something like that.
Not Al Sharpton?
No, not Al Sharpton. Dr. Sean McMillan. And he was very insightful, and he said very good and interesting things. But again, there was this one thing that he slipped in there. And that, to me, is a very problematic way of thinking about it for anyone, not for Black people, for anyone thinking in this way, which is this we narrative. We have been suffering long enough. We have been enduring this long enough. My question becomes, we as in
actually,
who?
Yeah, so... Right. There were actually a few points that I wanted to elaborate on.
Yeah, go ahead.
In relation to what you just said, I actually had a talk with somebody about this recently, and this idea of basically collectivizing an entire group of people into one boat and basically assimilating them into like this sort of hive mind complex where it's like, if they don't subscribe to a certain belief or a certain set of values, then they're not considered that race. Like, for example, if you're a Black Republican, you're considered a race traitor in many respects.
Yeah.
There was a recent comment that came out by Joe Biden recently saying that if you don't vote for me, then you're not Black. And
I need to see that.
That guy spouts a bunch of nonsense these days. He's barely sane. He needs to be hospitalized, but that's besides the point. What I actually wanted to get into, so throughout this entire event, throughout this entire protest, the thing that I've been noticing is I've been going on my social media, and everybody has a take on this thing. Everybody has a take, and it more or less falls under the same umbrella. And one take that I thought was interesting was this idea that when it comes to Black mothers, for example, there is a general fear that the instant they send their son out to the street to take a walk to school or go to the grocery store, they're essentially putting their son's life in jeopardy. And that seems to be the general perception of a ton of mothers of color out there. Now, treading back a little bit, at one point in the 1980s, there was the child abduction panic, in which media outlets basically, like this is when the Amber Alert was created, and then these media outlets started covering a bunch of child abductions and were essentially demagoguing the issue and giving it 24/7 coverage, and it basically spiked the fear perception amongst a bunch of parents. And then suddenly all these parents decided, okay, we are going to keep a 24/7 eye on our children. We are not going to allow them to be independent. We're not going to allow them to go anywhere without some form of accompaniment. And as a result, many psychologists have come to the conclusion that because these kids have been coddled from birth to basically young adulthood, they've been what's the term? They've essentially become fragile in that whatever obstacle comes their way, they recoil at the sight of that obstacle as opposed to confronting that obstacle. Yeah. And that might be, and they trace it back to maybe that child panic. Now, in relation to this, I want to ask you right now, do you think that this general fear that comes from mothers of color about the potential of their child being shot by a police officer, do you think that this is a set reality, or do you think that this is something that is being hyperbolized by the media so that they could basically stow panic amongst their viewers? As in, like, when we reflect back on this a decade or 2 decades from now, do you think people are going to look at this as an overreaction?
That's a difficult question. There's, again, it would not be correct for me to oversimplify it to a simple yes or no, but my answer would be this: that within the people that are still alive today, like there are people who are still alive today who did live during a period of time where there was a threat posed to Black people by police officers, right? It's not that long ago that we would say, oh, this was 300 years ago, why are you still tripping? No, this is within the people's lifetime who are still alive today. So I don't think it's irrational from that perspective that, oh, this is just completely fabricated. People are just holding on to things. No, so there's some caveat to it. But to more specifically answer your question, I mean, there is this aspect of dramatization that definitely exacerbates the reality, because even as I'm looking at the statistics for 2019, I think if I remember correctly, it was like 235 Black people were shot and killed by police officers in total for the whole year. Now, any one of those instances that was not justified, meaning they did not actually pose a direct threat to someone else's or the police officers' lives, like they were running away or they're like kneeling on the ground with their hands up, whatever the case may be, anytime it was a murder, as I defined earlier, that is an injustice that needs to be addressed, right? So I'm not trying to dismiss it as if that doesn't matter. Each one of those is horrific, needs to be addressed, and justice needs to be served. That is irrelevant to my point. But to confuse the individual instances with, again, an overarching systemic problem is not correct. The same way that if someone were to make the case that in the US or on college campuses there's a rape culture, that would be a borderline blasphemous statement to make, because there is no such thing as a rape culture on campuses. There might be small groups of individuals that do this kind of horrific stuff and who think that it's okay, but that does not mean that on the college campus as a whole there is a culture that encourages and celebrates and desires rape.
Exactly.
That is simply a completely false statement to make. And so, again, it's the same here. When you have 235 people who suffer this kind of death within a year from that particular race, out of hundreds of millions of people, of which tens of millions, if not over 100 million, of which probably tens of millions, but I think it must be over 100 million, of which are Black, and 235 of them die in this fashion, according to the Washington Post, at least. I mean, different sources might have some different information, but whatever it is, it cannot supersede a number that becomes fearful. So, for example, like you were saying about earlier, about the abductions, the rates of random child abductions, right? Most child abductions are one of the parents that does not have custody taking the child. I'm saying random child abductions, some guy driving up with a van on the side of the road and picking up a kid and driving them away. Something like that, some weird, obscure crime like that is so infrequent that to shape your life around that and say, you know what, my child can now not walk on a 15-minute walk to school on a main public road alongside other parents and kids, because that does happen once in 10 million across the country. I'm going to shape my life around that. If we start shaping our lives around extremely improbable things, such as that, then we are not living our lives correctly, in my opinion, and inconsistently. For example, driving has a very big risk of dying, dismemberment, injury, whatever, but you're willing to drive. No one says, no, don't drive because there's a 1 in a 100,000 chance that you might get in a fatal car accident. They say, no, I need to take that risk. But apparently, that risk doesn't need to be taken when it is for the benefit of our children to grow up into healthy adults. So that would be my take on it, that it is not completely unfounded, right? Some people do happen to die like that, and it is not completely unfounded. There are people within the current generation, like you defined it earlier, like people who are alive today, who remember that was part of their life to live in fear like that, because they would get brutalized by police officers because there was systemic racism at that point in time, that they grow up and they may not be able to get out of that mindset. And I wouldn't necessarily even fault them for that. You know, if people suffer stuff like that, how are you really gonna all of a sudden disregard that? But I don't think that it is a justifiable fear to now teach their children and say, when you're driving, you need to be afraid for your life because any given police officer might shoot you on the spot.
Yeah. You know, I was actually thinking, in relation to all of this, I started thinking about like the policy subscriptions that we had for, let's say, combating racism in the United States, and how oftentimes they would actually center around the heuristics of their constituency, as in if the constituency has a certain complaint, then their immediate solution is an immediate solution, but not a long-term solution. So, for example, in the case of wage inequality, like we were just talking about, we started diagnosing this problem individually, saying that, look, there's a slower rate of return on investments. They invest in less business assets. There's a myriad of circumstances and factors that contribute to wealth inequality, and we could have like 3-pronged policy subscriptions, or like multi-layered policy subscriptions that address these issues individually. Except in this time and day, oftentimes the solution would be, well, throw money in their direction, then everything will be okay. Like, I remember at one point, Cory Booker, when he was running for presidency, he wanted to set up these opportunity accounts, which were essentially baby bonds for newborns, in which they would be given a savings account and they would have a $1,000 deposit. And then after that point, he started talking about full-blown reparations. And all I could think is it's that we really do live in a country. We really did live in a time where people want easy solutions for problems that are so complex, so varied, that span the course of history. Like we have to take in so many different factors in order to solve these issues. And ultimately, for everyone, it comes down to just throw money in their direction. If they lost equity during the mortgage crisis, then simply set up a new housing bill. That'll solve all the problems. That'll solve the redlining sin. But it's oftentimes, I think to like the Native American reservations or the state of the Aboriginal people in Australia, and they're basically welfare dependent. And I mean, do you hear about how happy and cozy their lives are? No. Oftentimes you hear about the fact that the percentage of rape in Native American reservations is higher than anywhere else in the country, and only 50% of them get solved by the only 50% of them get solved by the Criminal Justice Bureau, and that the rest of them are discarded. So it's funny. We're living in a time where, I mean, even these protests right now, everything comes down to these very simple headline-y takes. And it seems like because we're thinking in this capacity, we actually might be exasperating the problem as opposed to fixing the problem, as in the solutions that people are surmising are only going to bring about more suffering for the people that they're trying to help.
Yeah.
And I don't know, do you agree with that line of thinking?
It somehow always comes back to identity politics. And the reason why is, again, for example, just throw money at them. Who's them? Like just any black person? Just like, here's some money? Like reparations. For whom? Any black person? Just anyone? Someone moved here 2 years ago from Belize and they happen to be black, they should be getting reparations? Like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, we can't just simply... That, to me, is the first problem. That obviously, we can't make laws for individuals, like, oh, you seen a furutan, you'll get $200 and make that a law. But at the same time, the laws need to be more specific than simply kind of this overarching kind of like, oh, if you're within this huge category, then you're entitled to something, or even the proposition of a law being like that, right? And this leads me back to something that I wanted to say earlier too, which is that when we have this narrative of black people or let's say there's systemic racism against black people within this country, and therefore, you know, the reason why they're suffering, they are one homogenous group of people, is because of the system, and the system is in and of itself inherently racist. That to me brings up several problems as well. The first one of which being that people who are not suffering are attributed the characteristic of undue suffering. So, for example, there's a pretty infamous video of Lil Wayne where he is in an interview and he says, I don't know what racism is. And the guy asks him, why? What do you mean? He said he was talking about this encounter one time with police officers where he was shot and wounded, I think, and he was laying on the ground. And the police officers like raided the place that he was in. And he said that the police officers were jumping like over his body to get to the drugs and the guns that were in the place, right? And he said that every single one of those police officers that jumped over him was his words were blacker than he is, but let it suffice that they were simply black. And then he said that the only police officer who stopped and tended to his wounds picked him up and took him to a hospital happened to be white. So he says, I don't know what racism is. So should we lump him in with all these other quote unquote people who are suffering simply because of the color of his skin? Are we attributing an injustice to him that he himself does not attribute to himself? It is the reverse of what I was saying earlier, where people who were suffering the consequences of inadequacy or of evil or of crimes are now dismissed because they do not fit the narrative, but also people are included who should not be included in the narrative. And again, this is what it boils down to for me. The reason why things continue the way they are is because we're trying to fix a problem that is not there. Throwing money at a certain demographics does not help the problem. Admitting people into college because of their race does not help the problem, because the problem is something beyond that. It is not simply, it's like, that's why when you look at the numbers from such an overarching perspective of, within this particular community of that racial community, there are less college degrees. The solution is, let's give them more college degrees. It seems intuitive, but when the problem is not that they don't have college degrees because they don't get admitted into colleges in the sense that there's some kind of a racist problem there, the problem might be that the culture within those communities are in a way that they do not foster and develop people who then are properly, equipped for going to college. And that's why, for example, earlier when you were talking about the differences in how wealth is managed and savings and all of that, there's a pretty interesting children's book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad, where he talks about how what rich people apparently teach their children is different than what poor people teach their children. And it's a generalization, but I mean, his point is simply that there are things that are taught to children when it comes to wealth management, savings, this and that is not being taught to children of other races or ethnicities if they happen to be poor, right? Or in general, I guess it's more of a poor-rich thing than a racial thing. But, there are different ways of looking at this issue. And I think that we need to look at everything equally and not do some kind of moral posturing of saying, it's this and this only, and once we fix that, everything is fine. No. There's a lot of things going on, and we need to look at each of them equally and determine what the role is that they play in the creation of the current circumstances. Because people can't deny that the current circumstances are problematic. The fact that within poor communities where there are higher crimes, there are more minorities. That is a problem that needs to be looked at and understood and fixed. And it doesn't need to be fixed as in there needs to be a third white, a third black, a third Hispanic, then it's okay that they're poor and suffering. But the fact that they're poor and suffering needs to be addressed. And the fact that there is more minorities than white people needs to be evaluated and properly understood and also addressed. So all of these things need to be looked at in a different way. But if we just paint it with the brush of racism, it won't get fixed, because that is not the sole thing that is causing all of these problems that are happening.
Right, and on that level, we're in agreement. In fact, there's a bit of confusion on my end because, so what I was essentially trying to say was that with relation to policy subscriptions, when
Yes.
people end up using simple heuristics as the basis of a diagnosis for an incredibly complex problem, that oftentimes the end result will end up being worse in term as compared to where they were before. And for example, we were talking about you were just talking about college admittance, and the fact is that a lot of people who get into high-end universities through the affirmative action program oftentimes simply get admitted, but are not vetted or trained in a way to actually tackle the workload that comes with going into places like Harvard compared to their public school district, where the discrepancy in education quality is massive. And as a result, the situation is worse because beforehand they just didn't get into that college. Afterwards, they got into that college, might have paid a substantial tuition fee, maybe failed a ton of courses, then simply had to drop out later, and that was a failed return on investment. So not only don't they have a college degree anymore, but they've lost a lot of money as a result of that. So what I'm trying to say is that with relation to policy making for any such controversial subject, that there needs to be a comprehensive examination as to what needs to be done. It can't just be, there's not enough, we don't have enough diversity in our university. Well, pluck out some kids from these lower income minority neighborhoods. What needs to happen is there needs to be comprehensive programs within that public school that basically preps them for that college experience so that they're not overwhelmed by the time that they get there. Or better yet, there needs to be a complete overhaul in how we deal with public education so that it's reflective of the college experience in the future. The fact that, I think we're in agreement there, right? Where essentially the policy needs to match the complexity of the issue that we're dealing with. And it can't just be a simple appeal to your constituency. I think the problem that we face right now is politicians try to appeal to their constituency's sense of immediacy, in that people want solutions now, not later. And I think that's the big problem with policymaking today. The only way to comprehensively solve issues in the short run is to simply throw money at people or give them what they desire. But without proper training, without proper vetting that goes into these sort of things, then you're essentially going to end up with a middle of the road this might sound controversial, but you end up with a middle of the road population that essentially piggybacks off the no, that's not the right term. Oh God, how do I phrase this correctly? You have a population that is essentially dependent on welfare, and as a result of that, any semblance of social mobility that they might attain is simply done and done with, because their basic needs are being given. And that doesn't incentivize better behavior in the future. I mean, again, we know this with relation to the Aboriginal people or the Native American reservations. They're not living a great life right now, but they're also completely dependent on welfare. Yeah. So, I mean, can we? Yeah, I mean, I guess going back to that original question, do you agree that simple policy subscriptions end up exasperating the problem as opposed to mitigating it?
Yeah, from that perspective, yes, I agree with you. I mean, like you said, I think, the bigger problem with all of this is I was listening to this guy, it was like Slavoj Zezik or something like that.
Isn't he the guy that debated Jordan Peterson?
He did.
Yeah.
But
he's a bit of a nut.
Well, he has his quirks, and it seems like, and I don't want to misdiagnose him, I'm not an expert in this in any way whatsoever, but it seemed like he might have some kind of a form of Tourette's or something, because he kept on like sniveling and doing stuff with his nose and face that seemed like it was a little out of his control. But what he was saying was actually kind of insightful along the lines of this, where it was like, within the narrative of oppressor and oppressed, right? But sorry, before I even go there, to more directly answer your question, in this case, it's just a yes, because what it plays into is this narrative of victimization, of lack of controls and autonomy over your own life. The narrative of the suffering that you currently endure is not due to your own shortcomings, but it is because of a system that has failed you. And sometimes, to a degree, that is of course true. There are people who are currently suffering because of because of a system that is not adequately equipped to properly take care of people who need to be taken care of, right? That is an aspect of it. But to deprive a population of their sense of autonomy over their own lives, and to say that you yourself are not capable of pulling yourself out of the situation you're in, you need the assistance from us. You need the assistance of, other people granting you something that otherwise you would not have gotten out of merit. And that to me is a problematic narrative to begin with. The one of you yourself are not capable of doing something about your own circumstances. You need to have external intervention. That to me is a very, very problematic thing to say, because I think that not every individual, because, okay, there are some people who are, mentally handicapped and are simply not capable. But barring those kinds of exceptions, human beings are capable of changing their lives for the better or for the worse. Sometimes there's a certain quote-unquote glass ceiling depending on where you are and who you are, but I don't think that has necessarily much to do with race, and more so to do with who you know, what is your current income, what is the income of your parents, where are you, there's a lot of things that go into it. But to say that we need to create policies to help those people rather than we need to simply create an environment in which those people can thrive and succeed is, to me, what causes the problem, like you were saying. Because to tell them, you can't do this on your own, here's a check, is different than we have laid the foundation for you to live your life as free as possible. Now go out there and do your best. Those are two completely different stories. And one of those two is the story of empowering someone to be the best version of themselves that they can, and to give them the sense of security that there will be people who will protect them from undue harm and undue racism. Or not any racism is undue, but what I mean is undue conditions that impede them from living freely and fairly, versus the acknowledgement of the fact that the system is flawed and that the playing field is not even, and that cannot be fixed, and so here's a check instead. That to me is the problem, that we're not trying to work towards a world free of racism, free of injustice, but instead we're simply saying the world is as it is. You can go, we'll just, instead of trying to fix it, we'll just send you to college. Instead of trying to fix it, here's a check. And so I agree with you. That will simply result in the conditions continuing to stay the way they are or worsening, but not becoming better.
Right. Wait, did you wanted to say something afterwards, right?
Yeah. And so
you mentioned Slavoj Zocic, I forget his name.
Slavoj Žižek, something like that. I don't exactly remember his name, but one point that he was making was that another thing that's kind of, it's an interesting way of looking at it, and I appreciated his opinion on this, was that, another thing that we are depriving the maybe that's a little bit of an overgeneralization, but what happens a lot of times is that we do not allow black people to take responsibility for their own things. And what he said was that, he kind of said it in a joking way, but it's like, even when they are being evil, we don't allow them to be evil. Like, we don't allow them to be anything, because it's like, the example he was giving was, for example, we say if there's anything going wrong in Africa, then the liberal side of the debate would say, this is happening in Africa because of colonialism, because of this, because of that, because of white intervention. And a lot of times that's true in a lot of different ways. But for example, Pol Pot was doing what he did because he did them. Even if the history was influenced by colonialism and whatnot, he did what he did independent of that. We cannot deprive him of that responsibility and say, no, Pol Pot is not at fault here, it is because of colonialism. That would be a disgusting way of looking at history. And also then what we are saying is that Black people are not autonomous people and simply a product of their environment, that whether they do good or bad, it is not because they are good or bad or because they do good or bad things, it is because they are a product of their environment purely. And I also disagree with that narrative. I think everyone as an individual is, in their own capacity and to their own degree, capable of being good and being bad, whatever that definition might be. I don't want to define this here and now because I can't, but according to their own definition, doing good and bad things. And that happens independent of the history and independent of the circumstances. And every person needs to be given the chance to reap the benefits of their good and hard work, or of their life, or suffer the consequences of their life. And the only thing that we need to try to mitigate is to stop undue suffering or undue benefits on the other side as well for anyone when those things happen because of things that are completely out of their control and indicative of a bigger problem. And it needs to be undue. That's the biggest thing. If I murder someone and go to prison, my prison sentence is not undue. It is a direct and appropriate consequence of my act of murdering someone, right? If I go to med school for 20 years and then make more money than I do as an accountant currently, and I went to college for 4 years, it is not undue that I make more money. I did things that put me in a position where it is actually quite reasonable and fair for me to make more money. So for us to say that people are not individuals who can suffer or reap the benefits, but are simply a product of their environment entirely, and that we need to treat them as such, is to me a disservice to anyone.
So I see that you don't subscribe to causal determinism at all.
Causal determinism? I don't know what that is. Is that...
Well, you know what determinism is, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's basically the same premise that
okay.
All your actions are necessitated by antecedent events or past events, and all the conditions have been set up by essentially the laws of nature. So your actions, the cause of your actions are determined by preceding events that have happened throughout the course of your lifetime and through your ancestral history. So yeah. I take it that you do not subscribe to that model.
I do, but only to a degree. And the degree to which I do is that there needs to be... See, fairness also comes with the acknowledgement of conditions under which people exist that have put them in a position of undue hardship or suffering. So, for example, if someone comes from a certain, let's say, neighborhood where that unfortunately exists as it is today. So things are the way they are today. That also needs to be acknowledged. So things are the way they are today, but we need to work towards a better world, not towards a world of thinking that doesn't change, and so let's just throw money at them. But let's say there's a neighborhood where there's very high poverty, very high crime, the school is underfunded, there's not really great things going on there, there's not enough resources, there's not enough attention, there's not enough help. So now you have people who came out of that. So even if we try to make it better for the future, there's still people who suffered that environment, and that was an undue suffering.
Right.
That does need to be addressed, and that does need to be addressed in the way of let's help the people who were under those circumstances. But I'm saying that I think that the help for those individuals that needs to happen to simultaneously helping people who are there to get out of it. But what I mean by help is not by depriving them of their personal responsibility, but rather to give them the tools to do better things, and to then, it's kind of like sometimes when we look at some very, very poor parts of Africa, and then it's just like, oh, they have been poor for so long. Yes, because we don't give them things to become better. We only give them mosquito nets and food and water. Well, what about tools? What about equipment? What about things
Right.
so that they can be self-sustainable? What about teaching them? So that's the kind of help that I would be referring to, right? Like, let's give them the tools, the knowledge, the understanding, this, that, and then kind of leave the rest up to them, so to speak, right?
You know what's interesting, though?
And so to
One
that
thing-
degree, sorry, just to really quickly
ahead.
summarize, to that degree, I agree with causal consequentialism that, no, not consequentialism, sorry, causal determinism, that we need to acknowledge that conditions exist that can cause undue harm and which do cause undue harm, and that undue harm needs to be mitigated as much as possible, but that does not deprive people of personal responsibility. Both exist at the same
Right.
time, in my opinion.
To make a slight pivot, but it still deals with the topic at hand. One thing that I find interesting is that, I mean, we're essentially talking about these comprehensive solutions that can really mitigate the suffering of a ton of people. And what's interesting about the time that we live in is that there is this idea of absolutism where if something doesn't 100% concede to my interpretation of what's right, then that idea is completely wrong. So one thing that kills me, for example, is that one person might come up with a comprehensive solution for, like, okay, let's solve the housing crisis. For example, there are not enough housing units in this neighborhood to sustain the amount of incoming members of a population. Let's say there's like a ton of migrants that are entering San Francisco, but because there are not enough housing units, the prices exasperate. So it's like, okay, well, a solution could be we just simply build more housing units, and then we also mitigate the costs surrounding these homes. Or the point that I'm trying to make is that no matter what solution is thrown out, we live in a time and era where if it doesn't work to the oomph degree and everybody and not everybody benefits from that solution or so, then there's a sort of anger that precipitates as a result. Am I making sense when saying this?
Could you elaborate further?
Sure. So, okay, for example, there's this mindset of no man left behind, where basically in order for a solution to be okay, so for like there are these absolute set numbers or quotas that people establish for a certain policy, and if that quota is not met, then that policy is through and through seen as a failure. So, for example, let's say that there needs to be a gender quota for Parliament in Canada or Congress. Let's say that we get 33% or 43%. 43%, but we don't get that exact 50% number. Essentially, even though that's progress, it's never seen as enough. And my fear for the future is going to be that even no matter how much suffering we mitigate, there's always going to people want 100% the solutions that solve problems to the 100% degree. They want equality on all fronts. They want equal pay on all fronts. They want these simpler solutions that simply don't exist. But beyond that, does it make sense? What I'm saying?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
So ultimately, what I'm trying to get at is that, like, people are not in tangent with reality when wanting solutions that holistically solve a problem. Mm-hmm. And they don't account of things like the Pareto principle. Like, within any domain of distribution, there are going to be people on the lower end of that distribution that are not nearly as successful as some other people. Mm-hmm. And in this time and day, a lot of critics, a lot of social critics, a lot of professors, a lot of people in the far left, for example, would say that simply does not suffice. And which is why it's like, it's why everyone deems capitalism, like, well, not everybody, but people in the far left deem capitalism a total failure, but then think communism is a great solution because it holistically, they holistically interpret it as, oh, everybody is equal, nobody is left behind. That sounds like a great system. So, I mean, do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do, absolutely.
And do you agree with that basic premise that it seems like people have unreasonable expectations for how to change these problems that have ailed this country for several centuries or so?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say it's hard for me to say exactly whether I agree or disagree. I mean, I disagree with the premise that the only time something can be deemed properly executed is if it is exactly 100% what you want it to be. No, whenever you forecast something, there's going to be variables that you cannot take into consideration, and your forecast will practically always be different from the actual result. And then the other question is, what is important to you? Is the outcome important to you, or is the method important to you? And that is also an important distinction. So, for example, do we want to say, what's important to me is that it's half men, half women, doesn't matter to me how it happens, just as long as that's the case, right? So then that becomes problematic. What do you mean it doesn't matter how that happens? It's just important that that is the case. Like, that's not how democracies work. How democracies work is that the method is what's important, meaning you get to choose whoever you want, and the outcome is actually not that important, which is that whoever ends up in there, it doesn't matter who they are or what they are. What matters is that that person was elected a certain way. Do you see what I'm saying? So that is my first problem with this, that it's a very consequentialist way of looking at the world, of as long as we get the results that we want, how we get there doesn't really matter. And I wholeheartedly, absolutely, and categorically, in every possible way and with every bone in my body, absolutely deny that line of thinking. The problem is that we are trying to work towards solutions of outcomes rather than solutions of methods, right? For example, the justice system is not just if the prison population is half black, half white. We can't then say, oh, now it's just because it's half black, half white. That's not the definition of justice. The definition of justice is that every person who is in there for the amount of time that is just for the crime that they committed. That is what justice is, right? And so that is an outcome of a method being in place that allows a certain condition to exist. The outcome of 50-50 is not at all the indication of justice having been served. And so the same thing applies to these policies that you're talking about. The simple fact that there is, no person under the poverty line does not mean that now all of a sudden society is good and equitable. You know, like there's so many things that go into it. Obviously, that's desirable in and of itself, right? But that doesn't mean that now all of a sudden we have this society that we want because a certain quota was met. And so, for example, you know, when I think about the wages and poverty and stuff like that, I always think to myself, well, what is the society that we're trying to create? Are we trying to create a society that is free of suffering? We don't want anyone to suffer? No, that's ridiculous. We need suffering. Suffering is a necessity of life, proper life. But what we need to try to stop is undue suffering. Things that are beyond. Now, the difficult part is that sometimes that's subjective, and sometimes people think, well, it's undue suffering for me to study a lot, so I want to have a take-home test with open book. And someone might say, well, no, it's not undue suffering for you to study a lot, because that's what you're supposed to be doing in college. You're not supposed to be getting take-home open book tests. That's the purpose, right? And so that is where the debate is important on how do we implement this. But and that's where all the nuance comes into play. But to simply try to eliminate all suffering and to deem any version and kind of suffering, including the type of suffering that is a consequence of your own actions, even if it's unintentional, is necessary. It's necessary. If you don't study enough, like for example, I got a little bit of a bailout, but that bailout was also combined with my own hard work. So when I was going to school in Europe, I was doing really bad in school. I was getting C's and F's and whatnot, and I had really bad grades. And I actually didn't even repeat. Sorry, I did repeat 10th grade twice, so I never even passed 10th grade when I was in Europe. And then when I moved to the US, because they have the No Child Left Behind, funny enough, that's almost exactly what you said earlier, policy, there is no such thing as repeating grades unless you want to. You can continue and then just make up the classes. And that's exactly what happened. They put me into school as a senior, even though I never passed 10th grade, but because of my age, I was a senior. And then they just made me take these online classes on the computer to make up all of the F's that I had before. And then when I got admitted into university, they gave me a bailout over there too, which was, hey, we'll give you we'll admit you, and thanks to my dad too, he pulled some strings, but whatever, and we'll put you on probation. And if you do well, then you do well. And so I got that chance, but it was combined with personal responsibility. They said, when you're in high school, you need to get A's. Otherwise, we can't admit you. And I got A's. When I was admitted into university, they said, look, you need to maintain this GPA. If you don't, you violate your probation. And I kept up my GPA. And that's kind of what I was saying earlier. They looked at my circumstances and they said, oh, he came from a certain circumstance where he was not performing properly. Let's not dismiss him and let's give him another chance. Maybe he just wasn't in the right place at the right time. But once they gave me that chance, it was my responsibility to do better. They didn't just simply say, okay, we'll just admit you no matter what, and you can stay here even if you fail. And that's, I don't know if I'm going too much on a tangent here, but that's kind of what policies, in my opinion, should be like too. Not that we want to have an outcome. Like, imagine if they said, we want the outcome to be that you graduate from this university, it doesn't matter how. And then when I'm taking tests, I'm failing, and then they're like, well, you're failing, okay, let's give you take-home tests. Obviously, this is too hard. That's not how to go about this. And so, same thing with these policies. The policies shouldn't be, here are the tools. Oh, you can't do this with the tools? Let's make it easier. Let's make it easier. Let's make it easier. Like, at some point, there needs to be an acknowledgement that some people do simply not succeed in a certain type of environment, and that needs to be addressed one way, and some people do, but need the right tools, and that needs to be addressed a different way. And to say that there is failing and suffering in the world, therefore there is fault with what we are doing, is, I think, not the right way of looking at it, because it's very consequentialist of only looking at the results, and as long as the results are not what you want them to be, then that is indicative of a certain problem being the case.
So I want to say two more things, and then I think we should close shop for today.
Yes, sir.
Uh, to address two of your points, I mean, one thing I liked, I think that it was the way you phrased it, just like the ends don't justify the means, or yeah, that was it, or is it the other way around? The means don't justify the ends?
No,
it's the ends don't justify the means.
Yeah, but essentially I'm saying we need to work towards the means being in place, not towards the end being in place.
No, right. And I wanted to further extrapolate on that point to say that it doesn't matter how just any one cause might be and how good their intentions might be. The means on how you get to your goal or your end result matter extensively. So, for example, let's take the experiences of people in most college campuses. Like, again, the idea of diversity and representation in schools is ultimately not a bad thing. But the problem around that is if you do it via authoritative means, if you hold your faculty and your student body hostage in order to get to a certain point, then it doesn't matter how good the intentions are. Ultimately, people are going to push back and view your organization or you as an individual in an antagonistic lens.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one point I want to make. Just that any form of authoritarianism just doesn't work. Throughout history, all authoritarian causes almost always fail, no matter how good the intention. The other point that I want to make has to do with this idea of degrees of suffering. So, I mean, going back to this idea of looking at a minority group or a population through the lens of a collective, in many respects, that actually takes away from the individual accounts of a single human being suffering.
Yeah.
So one person's suffering is always going to be greater than another person's suffering. But the instance you put that suffering through the lens of a movement, in some respects, you might be honoring that person's suffering, but at the same time, you also might simultaneously be taking away from their experiences. And what I mean by that is that there are some individuals out there that look at these particular set of events and then think to themselves, well, you know what? This is indicative of all Black trauma or trauma that's associated to my race. And the suffering that he went through is reflected through all of us. And in no way, shape, or form is that true. No group of individuals have the same exact experiences, and yet certain movements will have you believe that Black trauma, for example, is a singular thing. It's a singular thing, and there's a singular diagnosis for it. The best way to differentiate this is it's this. There are lower income kids out there who go into neighborhoods with a precipitous amount of gang violence and the a possibility of having to deal with some semblance of police brutality. That's a single individual's experience. But then there is, let's say a black student who grew up in a relatively affluent family and then has gone to a college. Those experiences are in no way, shape, or form similar, and yet what I'm seeing happening right now is that people are using this tragedy to incentivize their point of view. So it's like, if I say something about my suffering, if I say something about my racism or racism that I've been dealt with in my life, you can't object to it, or something along those lines. Like, the instance a tragedy befalls another person, suddenly other people try to obfuscate that narrative for themselves, and they essentially try to take advantage of a tragedy to bolster their point of view, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, that's essentially the claim of intersectionality again, of like, one group of people is oppressed by another group of people, and if you're part of that group, you're automatically either the oppressed or the oppressor. So again, completely deprived of your individuality, and you're only a reflection of the group. That's the interesting thing to me. It has become that the individual is the reflection of the group's characteristics rather than the group being a reflection of similar characteristics within the individuals that comprise that group, right? So like, it's not like you could say that, for example, let's say that I play basketball, right? So you have this group of basketball players. Now, let's say someone says, well, basketball players have tattoos. They, have a certain demeanor to them. They listen to certain kind of music. They watch certain kinds of things. They suffer certain kinds of things. And you describe this basketball player, right? You say, this is, when I hear basketball player, this is what I think. And so now anytime anyone says I'm a basketball player, they are treated as if they are that representation of what is the perceived characteristics of individuals within that group, rather than the only thing they have in common is that they play basketball. Everything else is left up to the individual. Again, for example, when we think about race, the only thing that they truly, all of them have in common is that they are part of the same race. Everything else is then the individual. And I think that's where I agree with you, that we're depriving them of their individuality by only looking at it like that.
But I guess what I'm also trying to say is that, like this form of collectivization actually just takes away from an individual's experience, because suddenly other people try to obfuscate that experience and almost take it for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And exasperate their own, and they start exasperating their own trauma, because at this point victimization acts as a form of social currency. It's like, oh, this person has been dealt an insane amount of undue suffering. Well, I need to be more like him to a certain extent, or yeah.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. An extremely affluent person who has not really had any kinds of troubles in his or her life to say that we have been suffering, putting themselves in the same category as someone else who has had undue suffering, is what you're saying, right? Like someone just putting themselves in the same category just because they happen to be of the same race.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. That's precisely my point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, on that note, this was a productive discussion. I cannot wait for you to post this and get a bunch of dislikes.
Yeah, right.
Man. Anyways, well, thank you for your time, and to all our viewers, thank you for listening. Until the next podcast.
Yes, until the next podcast.
Take care, guys.